The practices that were common during the Middle Ages continue to have an impact on modern wedding rituals, such as the habit of reading 3 separate banns, a public announcement of one's desire to marry, and making vows in the present tense. In point of fact, the word wedding itself has its origins in the Middle Ages. However, there were a few things that were quite different. Couples did not need to marry in a church. For Christians living in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, getting married was a straightforward process. Couples did not require the consent of their families or the presence of a priest in order to get married, as this was mandated by the church, which was also responsible for enforcing marriage legislation. In spite of the fact that tying the knot could be done in a couple of minutes, demonstrating that you were married was frequently difficult. In spite of the fact that the church controlled marriage, or at least attempted to control it, couples were not required to get married in a place of worship. People have been known to get married anywhere, including on the street, in a bar, at a friend's house, and even in their beds, according to official records. The agreement of both parties was all that was necessary to constitute a lawful and legally binding marriage at the time. People did get married near churches in England so that the ceremony would have more of a spiritual significance, and they did so frequently at the church door, which resulted in some quite wonderful church porches being added to earlier structures, but this did not always require the presence of a priest. You don't need parental consent. As a result of the fact that marriage was the only acceptable venue for sexual activity throughout the medieval period, Christians were permitted to marry as soon as they reached puberty, which was typically considered to begin at the age of 12 for women and 14 for men at the time. It was not necessary to obtain parental permission. When this legislation was finally altered in England in the 18th century, the old regulations still held in Scotland. Because of this, communities immediately across the border in Scotland, such as Gretna Green, became a destination for English couples who defied their families' wishes by being married. Despite the fact that the medieval church promoted freely given permission as the cornerstone of marriage, in practice, families and social networks typically had a significant lot of influence over the choice and approval of marriage partners. This was true even though the church upheld freely given consent as the foundation of marriage. It was also common practice for people of all social classes to make certain pre-enup agreements in order to provide for themselves, their children, and any widows or widowers they might become. Additionally, it was expected of everyone to seek the consent of their lord, and monarchs consulted with their advisors regarding the weddings of both themselves and their children. It was especially frowned upon for persons of various social classes to get married to each other. Having sex created a legally binding marriage. It was possible for a couple to legally wed in the Middle Ages using a variety of spoken and non-verbal rites and ceremonies. The words of present consent were a verbal expression that may be used to convey consent to marry. However, there was no set phrase or formula that was required. It was not necessary for a present consent marriage to be consummated in order for it to be recognized. On the other hand, if the couple had previously discussed getting married at some point in the future and then had intercourse, this was seen to be a physical manifestation of current consent. Therefore, the act of having sexual relations constitutes the beginning of a marriage that is legally obligatory for engaged couples. Giving and receiving an object that is known in English as a wed is another way to demonstrate consent. A wed could be any present recognized by those concerned to imply agreement to marriage, but most commonly a ring was exchanged as a wed. The marriage was made by a wedding, in which a man presented a woman with a ring and she accepted it. Married or not married? It is abundantly evident that there was some level of confusion. It is possible that it will be difficult to determine whether or not a couple is married, and the partners themselves might not even be in agreement. A warning was included in the statutes that were issued by the English Church between the years 1217 and 1219. It stated that no man should place a ring of reeds or another material, vile or precious, on a young woman's hands in jest, so that he might more easily fornicate with them, lest while he thinks himself to be joking, he pledge himself to the burdens of matrimony. The great majority of marriage cases that were heard in court were intended to either enforce or prove that a marriage had taken place. These matters were brought before the court. In the 12th century, after much argument, theologians came to the conclusion that marriage was a holy sacrament. As a result, marital mix-ups became a source of concern for the clergy. This was not a piece of symbolism that should be taken lightly, as it signified the union of Christ and the Church. The joining of a man and a woman in marriage and sex reflected the unity of Christ and the Church. You didn't need witnesses. It was not required to have other people witness a marriage because God was the ultimate witness. However, it was highly advised to eliminate any question that may have arisen from the ceremony. There was also the option of holding the ceremony in a church, but doing so was in no way required, and the available evidence suggests that only a small percentage of couples actually did so. Before they exchanged their vows in front of a priest, many of those couples had already been legally married by either word or deed in some other capacity. Divorce was not an option. There was no such thing as divorce in the sense that we know it now. The only way to get out of a marriage legally was to demonstrate that it never actually took place in the first place. It was considered bigamy for a Christian to be married to more than one person at the same time, and if a Christian was already linked to the church by a religious vow, they were not allowed to marry. In addition to not having any previous marriage obligations, you had to be planning to wed another Christian. Because of the violation of these regulations, the marriage was instantly dissolved. You couldn't marry a relative, even if you only had a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent in common. There were also a number of further impediments that should have prevented a marriage from going forward, but which might have been excused in certain situations if the marriage had already taken place. It was forbidden to marry for those who were already related to each other. The concept of family was understood in a fairly broad sense. Before the year 1215, two people who shared a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent were considered to be too closely related to marry one another. Because of the difficulty in enforcing this rule and the potential for it to be abused, the unexpected discovery of a long-lost relative may be used to neatly end a marriage. The definitions of incest were revised by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and the threshold for incest was lowered to the presence of a common great-great-grandparent. In addition to being related by blood, other links could also make marriage illegal. For instance, godparents and godchildren were not permitted to marry since they were considered to be spiritually tied to one another. Additionally, close in-laws were not permitted to marry either. There was no speak now or forever, hold your peace. As part of the reforms that took place in 1215, the practice of reading the banns was initiated in an effort to clear the way for weddings by removing any potential obstacles. However, prior to the time of the Reformation, there was no such thing as the phrase, "Speak now or forever hold your peace." During the Middle Ages, difficulties that surfaced or were brought to light after the marriage may have a significant influence. For instance, Joan of Kent, who later wed Edward the Black Prince and became the mother of the future king Richard II, was married in her early teens with full publicity and a church service to an aristocrat. However, after approximately 8 years, this marriage was overturned in the papal court, and she was returned to a knight whom she had secretly married without her family's knowledge or approval when she was 12. It is difficult to determine how many people in medieval times married the person they loved, or how many of those people discovered love in their marriage. There was unquestionably a difference between having free consent to marry and absolutely free choice in other aspects of life. The fact that the vast majority of medieval people did marry and typically remarried after becoming widowed suggests that marriage was desired, even if merely as the social standard. What is evident is that the vast majority of medieval people did marry. We hope you liked this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.